United States Army general walked into the Australian SAS squadron briefing room at Nui Dat in the autumn of 1968, uninvited, unannounced, and carrying a folder of typewritten operational directives that he fully expected would be implemented before the end of the week. He had reviewed the patrol reports. He had studied the kill ratios. He had read the intelligence summaries. And none of it made sense to him because none of it corresponded to anything his military education had prepared him to understand. He sat down across from the Australian SAS squadron commander, placed the folder on the table between them, and spoke the words that would become the opening salvo in one of the most consequential doctrinal confrontations of the entire Vietnam War. These methods your men are using in the field. They are not in our doctrine. They cannot be validated. They will be brought into conformity with Military Assistance Command Vietnam standards immediately. The Australian squadron commander looked at the folder. He looked at the general. He did not open the folder. He said very quietly, "We understand your concern, sir." And then he said nothing else at all. Wait, what? A 5-man patrol that had been operating for 19 days behind enemy lines in the Mae Tao Mountains, deep in territory that American battalion commanders wouldn't enter without air support, and 2 armored personnel carriers for every rifle company, was being told its methods weren't in the manual. A unit that had just handed its task force commander the most detailed enemy logistics intelligence Phuoc Tuy province had seen in 2 years of war was being instructed to conform to American standards? Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think, because what that general was really confronting wasn't a tactics problem, it wasn't a coordination problem, it wasn't even a doctrine problem, not technically. What he was confronting was the accumulated weight of a military methodology so different from his own, so fundamentally rooted in a different way of understanding what war in a jungle actually requires, that his entire framework for evaluating military effectiveness had simply ceased to function in its presence. And the quiet Australian squadron commander, who said almost nothing in response, knew exactly what was happening, because this was not the first time. It would not be the last. By the time Australian SAS forces departed Vietnam in 1971, they had performed 1,200 combat patrols, with 1 killed in action, 1 dead from wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness, with 28 more wounded in action, and they had killed 600 enemy troops, the highest kill ratio of the entire war. Read that again. When 120 Australian SAS troopers arrived in Vietnam in 1966, American commanders were polite but skeptical. What could such a small force accomplish in a war consuming 500,000 American troops? 3 years later, the Pentagon was desperately trying to copy their methods, and failing. That gap between skepticism and desperation, between the general's folder of directives and the Australian's silence across the table, is the story we are going to tell. And by the end of it, you will understand not just why the Viet Cong called these men something that translated roughly as jungle ghosts, but why a United States Army general found their methods so deeply threatening that he needed them to stop. Stay with me. To understand what the American general was looking at in that folder and why it frightened him so thoroughly, you first need to understand what the Australian SAS actually was in 1966 when they arrived in Phuoc Tuy province. Not what the name suggests to someone raised on American special operations culture. Not what the Hollywood version of Special Forces looks like. What the Australian Special Air Service Regiment actually was at that moment in that country, doing that job. The unit had been formed in July 1957 as the 1st Special Air Service Company, Royal Australian Infantry, modelled on the British Special Air Service, and its first mission, in February 1965, was to quell insurgencies on Borneo. That Borneo experience matters more than almost anything else in understanding what happened in Phuoc Tuy Province. In Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation, the SAS proved itself in undeniable jungle war, with soldiers living in the jungle, sometimes on patrols for months, learning how to track the enemy, lay ambushes, and defeat him at his own game. And that would prove effective again in Vietnam. This wasn't training by instruction. This was knowledge acquired through extended immersion in the specific kind of warfare that Vietnam would demand. When the regiment arrived in Southeast Asia for the second time, it arrived carrying a kind of institutional memory that no American unit possessed, not because Americans lacked courage or competence, but because Americans had not spent a decade in that specific crucible. Between 1966 and 1971, each of 3 Sabre squadrons of the Special Air Service Regiment completed 2 tours of Vietnam. The SAS was based at Nui Dat, where it acted as the eyes and ears of the 1st Australian Task Force, and operated throughout Phuoc Tuy Province, as well as in Bien Hoa, Long Can, and Binh Tuy provinces. Each Sabre squadron brought with it a New Zealand SAS trooper attached to every patrol. Each brought a methodology so refined through Borneo operations that its core principles had become second nature to every man who made it through selection. The principles themselves were not complicated. They were just extraordinarily difficult to practice. Patience, silence, distance, time. Those 4 things were the architecture of everything the Australian SAS did in Vietnam, and they were the 4 things the American general's folder was telling them to abandon. The patrols themselves were the heart of the methodology. SAS troopers would operate on missions in the areas surrounding friendly bases, with small fire teams of 4 to 6 men moving much more slowly than any other unit, even other special operations units. In practice, this meant movement rates that struck American observers as almost incomprehensible. A 5-man patrol covering 2 kilometers in 6 hours. Men moving through primary jungle so quietly that wildlife didn't register their passage. Not because they were moving slowly for lack of fitness, these were among the most physically capable soldiers in the world, but because the doctrine demanded that they become part of the environment rather than an intrusion into it. Every boot placement was deliberate. Every branch was moved and replaced, not pushed through. Communication between patrol members during movement was reduced to a vocabulary of hand signals and prearranged sequences of eye contact. For days at a time, no spoken word was uttered. The Americans had long-range reconnaissance patrols. They had teams that operated in enemy territory for stretches of 3 to 7 days, maintaining regular radio contact with their base, pre-planning artillery support, ready to extract the moment they were compromised or made contact. The philosophy was intelligence first and firefight avoidance second. Get in, observe, get out, report. Operating as part of the 1st Australian Task Force, SAS troops were deployed in small, highly trained patrols to gather intelligence, track enemy movement, and conduct covert operations deep in enemy-held territory, with their primary mission being to locate and monitor Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army forces without direct engagement, moving silently and relying on stealth, providing vital intelligence that shaped larger military operations. All of that is accurate, and none of it captures what made Australian SAS different. The difference was duration, depth, and what the Australians were willing to do while inside enemy territory. Not 3 days, not 7. Most of the SAS patrol time was spent around the Maytau Mountains, enemy strongholds in the northeast of Phuoc Tui. The VC were located in a vast tract of jungle which could not be isolated outside the artillery and mortar range of the Australians at Nui Dat. The Australians went in anyway, without the security blanket of artillery range, without the assurance of quick helicopter extraction. 5 men in the dark heart of a province that the Viet Cong considered home territory, operating with a radio protocol of 1 scheduled brief transmission per day to maintain a mission's security. If something went wrong inside those mountains, help was not coming in the next 10 minutes. Help might not come for 48 hours. The men who served in those patrols understood this completely and volunteered anyway because the selection process had specifically identified those who could hold that understanding in their minds without it consuming them. During its 9 months in country, 3 Squadron conducted 134 patrols and tried and tested many of the techniques that would be used by later squadrons. Those techniques evolved rapidly through the first tours. Navigation in primary jungle without landmarks. Water discipline that stretched rations across durations American doctrines didn't account for. Methods of establishing observation posts within meters of enemy trail systems and remaining motionless for periods measured in days rather than hours. The psychological component of this, the sustained management of fear, hunger, discomfort, and the particular anxiety of knowing that the sounds you're hearing might be a company of soldiers rather than wildlife, was not something you could teach in a classroom. It was something the selection process filtered for, and the training environment deliberately cultivated. The selection process itself was the foundation. Not just physically demanding. Every special forces selection in every nation is physically demanding, but specifically oriented toward identifying men with an unusual relationship to time. Men who could function at peak effectiveness after days of sleep deprivation and minimal calories. Men who didn't require external validation to remain operationally confident. Men who found extended solitude in hostile environments not paralyzing, but almost, in a particular hard-edged way, comfortable. The regiment wasn't selecting athletes. It was selecting a very specific psychological type, and then building a methodology precisely suited to that type. When those men reached the jungle, they also carried something that American units were genuinely trying to acquire, but struggling to replicate. Individual skills, small unit tactics, night operations, and patrolling were all emphasized, and the recent Malayan counterinsurgency operations made Australian training lessons among the most valuable available. The Malayan emergency, which had run from 1948 to 1960, was the crucible in which an entire generation of Australian soldiers had learned to read jungle the way a farmer reads weather, not as abstract terrain to be crossed, but as a living system of information. The sounds of a disturbed bird flock 200 meters to the north meant something specific. The freshness of disturbed vegetation along a trail indicated time elapsed since passage with a precision that no instrument could match. The pattern of insect behavior around a particular area of ground could indicate the presence of camouflaged positions. This was knowledge passed down through personal instruction, man to man, patrol after patrol, and it had no equivalent in any American field manual. And then there was what happened when contact finally came. Because despite the emphasis on concealment and patience, the Australian SAS was not passive. It was not simply an intelligence-gathering unit that retreated at the first sign of the enemy. Once in contact with the enemy, the Australians unleashed a barrage of fire designed to make the enemy believe there were more men on the opposing side than there really were. The slow, quiet movement and hellish raking fire the Australians brought to the VC made them the most feared enemy unit in the areas of South Vietnam, and even the most quiet VC infiltrators could easily walk into a devastating Aussie ambush. This contact drill was the product of precise calculation. Writing of SAS patrol contacts, Captain A.W. Fremantle observed that when contact is initiated by the enemy, the immediate retaliation with a heavy volume of automatic fire, even if only in the general direction of the enemy, serves not only to keep his head down, but to create an illusion of a far larger force. 5 men, creating the acoustic signature of 30. The Viet Cong on the receiving end had no reliable way to determine how many men they'd engaged. The patrol would be displacing and extracting before the enemy could organize a coherent response. By the time a VC company commander had his men online and moving toward the contact point, the patrol was already 300 meters away and falling silent again. This is what the American General's folder was objecting to, not some abstract doctrinal difference. These specific practices, the extended duration patrols without continuous radio contact, the deep penetration into areas beyond artillery support range, the refusal to extract upon contact, the use of massed fire from tiny teams to create false impressions of force size, the deliberate cultivation of psychological uncertainty in the enemy by means that didn't appear in any American after-action framework. The methods were real. They were producing documented results, and they were invisible to the metrics the American general was using to evaluate military effectiveness in Vietnam. Because here was the structural problem. Julian Ewell, who commanded the 2nd Field Force from 1969 to 1970, was a controversial figure who supported using body count as the measure of success, a philosophy that had cascaded through the entire command culture of American forces in Vietnam. In Vietnam, Ewell commanded the 9th Infantry Division from 1968 to 1969, and later the 2nd Field Force, employing high-tempo operations that prioritized mobility, artillery support, and quantitative metrics, such as enemy body counts, to assess progress against Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. Under that framework, the question was always the same. How many did you kill today? How many artillery rounds were fired? How many helicopter sorties? The metrics required numbers, and numbers required activity of a type that generated numbers: large unit sweeps, frequent contacts, high rates of fire, high rates of resupply, high rates of movement. The Australian SAS generated numbers that looked wrong. A patrol of 5 men spending 19 days in the Mae Tao Mountains, making contact perhaps twice, killing perhaps 6 enemy soldiers in total, reporting back with 4 pages of detailed intelligence on trail usage, supply cache locations, leadership meeting patterns, and equipment types, that produced 6 kills and 1,900 man-hours of patrol time. By body count arithmetic, that was spectacularly inefficient. By Australian calculation, it was among the most operationally valuable things a small military force could do in a counterinsurgency. The intelligence those 6 deaths purchased, the patterns it revealed, the subsequent operations it enabled, that was worth more than a battalion sweep that killed 40 Viet Cong, destroyed 2 villages in the process, and told you nothing you hadn't already known about where the enemy would be next week. This disconnect was not a small thing. It was the entire war, compressed into a conversation between a folder of directives and a man who wouldn't open it. The Viet Cong understood what the Australians were doing better than the Americans did, which is its own kind of testimony. The SASR fought in the Vietnam War, where its members earned the nickname Ma Rung, meaning phantoms of the jungle for their stealthy maneuvers. The SAS operated deep behind enemy lines, conducting surveillance at close range, poised to spring into violent action at need. It was with good reason the Viet Cong came to call them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. That name was not a compliment in the sense of admiration, or not primarily. It was the operational description of something that had disrupted their ability to function in territory they believed they controlled. The Viet Cong knew exactly what was happening. They simply couldn't stop it, because they couldn't find it. You cannot prepare an ambush for something you cannot hear. You cannot plan an operation along a trail network you don't know is being observed. The Australian SAS was removing the enemy's sense of secure ground, and they were doing it so quietly that for months the enemy wasn't entirely sure they were doing it at all. While United States forces fought a war characterized by big battles, the 1st Australian Task Force was allocated an area of operations in Buoc Toi Province where, apart from a small number of major battles, the war took the form of a protracted counterinsurgency campaign against the National Liberation Front and the People's Army of Vietnam. The protracted nature of the struggle and the VC desire to avoid battle unless assured of success forced upon the 1st Australian Task Force the need to find the elusive enemy to bring him to battle. The SAS was the mechanism for that finding. Not a blunt instrument, not a hammer. A scalpel that spent weeks mapping exactly which organs to remove before it ever touched a target. The intelligence cycle that the SAS fed was unlike anything the American command had constructed. An Australian patrol would insert, carefully, walking well clear of the helicopter landing zone to defeat any observation by locals or enemy scouts who'd learned to watch where the helicopters touched down. After 5 years of SAS patrolling, the VC had finally become familiar with SAS insertion techniques, and from June 1970, it was not unusual for the Australians to be fired on by the VC shortly after landing in an area, which tells you something critical. It took the Viet Cong nearly 5 years to reliably detect Australian insertion patterns, despite fighting in their own home terrain, because the Australians were that careful and that variable. 5 years. American long-range reconnaissance patrol teams were being detected and compromised within hours of insertion in some areas, because American insertion techniques followed patterns the enemy had learned to identify within months. When a patrol reached its operational area, it would establish a series of observation posts on high ground or along trail networks, rotating between them to avoid leaving sign that would indicate a permanent position. The information they collected was granular to the point of being almost anthropological. Which trails carried what category of traffic, whether supply loads were increasing or decreasing, indicating buildup or dispersal. The physical condition of passing soldiers, well-fed and equipped, meant recent resupply from a functioning logistics chain. Haggard and lightly equipped meant pressure from operations. Meeting patterns at specific locations, the sounds of night activity, its location, its duration. All of this fed back through the single daily transmission, condensed and encrypted, to the Task Force Intelligence Cell at Nui Dat, and the intelligence cell, which was also not operating on American lines, used this information not to plan the next day's operations, but to build a predictive map of where the enemy would be in 2 weeks. This is what the American general had no framework for valuing: predictive intelligence. Intelligence that told you not where the enemy was yesterday, but where he would be tomorrow, and the day after, and the week after. The operational value of that was almost incalculable, but it couldn't be expressed as a daily body count, and it couldn't be generated by any method that looked active and aggressive by American standards. The conflict between the two systems came to a head in the specific context of the Maytao Mountains and the intelligence groundwork that led to Operation Marsden. Most SAS patrol time was spent around the Maytao Mountains, enemy strongholds in the northeast of Phuoc Tuy, where the VC were located in a vast tract of jungle which could not be isolated, outside artillery and mortar range, and it was the SAS's task to detect and report VC routes, with a month-long infantry operation eventually mounted to clear the Maytao Mountains in December 1969. What that summary doesn't convey is the months of patient SAS reconnaissance that made the operation possible. Patrols moving through jungle that American forces considered impassable without significant engineering support. Observations conducted over weeks, not days. The slow construction of a picture so complete that when the ground forces finally went in, they knew what they were looking for and approximately where it would be found. As part of Operation Marsden between the 1st and 28th of December 1969, the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and 2 companies of Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment assaulted the complex, capturing huge quantities of weapons, equipment, supplies, and pharmaceuticals, and destroyed the hospital complex. VC killed numbered 22, with 5 wounded and 21 prisoners taken, 14 of whom had been patients of the hospital, and approximately 1.5 tons of pharmaceuticals were captured, thought to be the largest amount ever seized in the war by Allied forces. None of that would have been locatable without months of SAS reconnaissance in territory that American doctrine would have required clearing by conventional means at enormous cost. The intelligence that made Marsden possible was the product of exactly the methods the American General's folder was trying to stop. A number of 1st Australian Task Force operations resulted in major defeats for the enemy, including Operation Marsden in 1969, whereupon enormous caches of weapons and supplies and the main hospital servicing the local communist forces were discovered and destroyed, and Operation Townsville in April 1970, whereupon Australian and New Zealand platoons captured the operational signals codes and one-time cipher pads used by the VC headquarters, with senior United States commanders, including General Creighton Abrams, alleged to have referred to it as the biggest intelligence coup of the war. The biggest intelligence coup of the war, achieved by a force 1/60th the size of American deployment, using methods that American doctrine couldn't validate, in an area that American doctrine would have approached with 10 times the personnel and 100 times the noise. The broader context in which all of this was unfolding was the 1ATF's fundamental strategic framework for Phuoc Tuy Province. From June 1966 to September 1971, Australia deployed the 1st Australian Task Force to Vietnam to join United States and other free world forces in supporting the government of the Republic of Vietnam against an insurgency mounted by the National Liberation Front and the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But the Australians approached that support mission with a strategic theory that diverged fundamentally from American thinking. Though considered a small component of the war, these troops from Australia and New Zealand were in fact the best trained and prepared for counterinsurgency warfare. The SAS squadron was the sharpest expression of that advantage, the unit that most completely embodied everything the Malayan experience had taught about how to fight an insurgency in jungle terrain. The Australian military effort in Phuoc Tuy deserves more credit than it has been given or is likely to get, wrote Creighton Burns of the Melbourne Age, as the withdrawal began. With limited troops and inadequate support and resources, the Australian task force had kept substantial Viet Cong forces off balance, disrupted their supply routes, and occasionally inflicted heavy casualties on them. The SAS was central to all three of those achievements. Keeping the enemy off balance required knowing where he was at all times, which required the patient patrol program the SAS ran continuously throughout the province. Disrupting supply routes required identifying those routes first, which required the deep reconnaissance patrols in the Mae Tau and the Long Hai that no other unit in the task force could conduct. The heavy casualties, when they came, were enabled by the intelligence the SAS produced and by the task force's ability to place ambush forces exactly where the enemy's predictable movement patterns said they would be. The American general's attempt to impose doctrinal conformity on all of this was, from the Australian perspective, not simply bureaucratically irritating, it was operationally dangerous. The specific techniques being questioned, extended patrol duration, reduced radio contact, deep penetration beyond fire support range, weren't preferences or stylistic choices. They were functional requirements. You could not observe the Mae Tau trail network from inside artillery range because artillery range didn't reach the trail network. You could not maintain the radio silence necessary for genuine concealment while transmitting hourly position updates on American schedule. You could not build the kind of granular, time-layered intelligence picture that made operations like Marsden possible by spending 3 days in an area and then extracting. The American standards being imposed were not just different. They were, in this specific operational context, incompatible with the mission itself. What the Australians understood, and what the American general genuinely could not see from inside his framework, was that the validity of a military method cannot be determined by whether it conforms to existing doctrine. It can only be determined by whether it achieves its operational objectives. SAS personnel were highly trained, and their role in Vietnam varied from conducting reconnaissance patrols and observing enemy movement to offensive operations deep in enemy territory. The SAS had the highest kill ratio of any Australian unit in Vietnam. That kill ratio, achieved by a handful of men on extended patrols in the deepest jungle in the province, was the result of a system working exactly as its designers had intended. The doctrine was not the problem. The doctrine was the solution. The American attempt to replicate what the Australians were doing was itself instructive. The Australian SAS were so effective in the field that the NVA called the Australians the ghosts of the jungle, and they even provided instructors to the United States Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol School. American forces attempted to incorporate Australian techniques, longer patrol durations, reduced radio contact, slower movement rates, greater emphasis on observation over contact. Some of these adaptations produced improvements. American LRRP teams that trained alongside Australians and genuinely absorbed their patience and their silence became meaningfully more effective. But the deeper elements of the Australian methodology resisted imitation, not because Americans lacked the individual qualities required, but because those qualities were the product of years of selection and training and operational experience that couldn't be compressed into a course or a directive. You could teach an American soldier to walk more slowly. You could not, in 6 weeks, give him the same relationship to jungle time that an Australian SAS trooper had spent his entire career developing. The exchange program itself became a point of tension. The SAS squadron carried out a number of different tasks in addition to jungle patrolling, with personnel going on exchange with American Special Forces, while American personnel joined the Australians. American observers attached to Australian patrols came back with accounts that sometimes read less like after-action reports and more like dispatches from a different dimension of warfare. Men who moved for 6 hours and covered a distance an American patrol would cover in 40 minutes. Men who heard things in the jungle that American soldiers couldn't identify. Men who maintained operational discipline under conditions of isolation and physical discomfort that American units were simply not trained to sustain for equivalent durations. The American officers writing these reports were not disparaging their Australian counterparts. They were baffled, and their bafflement was genuine, because what they were witnessing didn't fit any category in their professional vocabulary. In October, when Brigadier Cedric Pearson took over the task force and proved not as enthusiastic about the SAS as his predecessor Brigadier Hughes, the squadron's role subsequently reverted to intelligence gathering and some ambush patrols. This internal fluctuation in Australian command enthusiasm for SAS operations illustrates that the friction wasn't only external. Even within the Australian task force, there were commanders who found the SAS difficult to understand and integrate, partly because their methods were genuinely unusual, and partly because the results of patient intelligence collection were harder to demonstrate in briefings than body counts and terrain secured. The American pressure for doctrinal conformity found some resonance even within the Australian chain, whenever it was articulated loudly enough and at senior enough levels. But the SAS resisted, quietly and effectively, with the same patience they applied to their jungle operations. The Australian Squadron Command understood something that the American general did not, and that some of the more orthodox Australian commanders were only beginning to grasp. In a counterinsurgency, visible activity is not the same as effective activity. The loudest operation is rarely the most productive. The unit that covers the most ground in a week may understand that ground less well at the end of the week than it did at the beginning. A patrol that sits motionless for 3 days, watching a trail, might achieve more operational effect in those 3 days than a company sweep achieves in a month. This was not a comforting thought for commanders whose careers had been built on demonstrating aggressive initiative. It required an entirely different conceptual vocabulary for success, and that vocabulary simply did not exist in the American doctrine of the late 1960s. Critics, including investigative journalist Nick Turse, argued that the vast discrepancy between claimed enemy deaths and captured material in American operations indicated systematic atrocities, with Ewell's quantitative focus creating pressure on subordinates to prioritize kill tallies over verification of combatant status, while American commanders were caught in a metric spiral that was actively distorting operational decisions. The Australian SAS was quietly building an intelligence picture of Phuoc Tuy Province so comprehensive that captured VC documents began to reflect its effects. Viet Cong unit commanders writing to their higher headquarters, noted that Australian patrolled areas could no longer be reliably predicted as safe for logistics movement. That particular movements, which had been routine before the Australians arrived, were now too risky to attempt. That certain trail networks in the province's interior had become effectively unusable because the probability of walking into an Australian SAS ambush, silently placed and ferociously executed, was now too high to accept. This was exactly the strategic effect the Australians were seeking. Not a body count, a behavioral change, an enemy force that could no longer operate freely in territory it had held for years. That was the measure of success, and by that measure, the Australian SAS program in Phuoc Tuy province was succeeding in ways that the American general's folder couldn't see because it wasn't looking in the right direction. In 1971, the first Australian task force noted that one of the most formidable forces with which the task force had regularly to contend was D445 VC Local Force Battalion, rated by the task force as akin to a main force Viet Cong or People's Army of Vietnam unit in terms of military capability. That battalion had been the primary enemy force in Phuoc Tuy throughout the Australian commitment. The SAS's sustained operations against its logistics network, its movement corridors, its resupply routes, and its communication patterns had not destroyed D445, but they had degraded its operational effectiveness in Phuoc Tuy over 5 years, to the point where its ability to mount sustained offensive operations in the province had been fundamentally compromised. As a result of a failure at Bin Ba, all PAVN forces, including D440 Battalion, were temporarily forced out of Phuoc Tuy, retreating to Long Con province, and the unit generally performed poorly against Australian and New Zealand forces, eventually being disbanded in August 1970, with most of its personnel transferred to D445 Battalion. Entire North Vietnamese Army-backed local force battalions were being worn down and disbanded, not by massive firepower, by patient, relentless, invisible pressure. The general and his folder never won the argument. The Australian command protected its SAS methodology through the same structural independence that characterized the entire Australian approach to Phuoc Tuy province. American commanders could request, they could advise, they could express displeasure through official channels. What they could not do was order the Australian SAS to operate differently, because the Australian SAS answered to an Australian chain of command that answered ultimately to Canberra, not to Military Assistance Command Vietnam. The operational independence that infuriated American generals on the subject of body counts and tactical aggression also provided the insulation that allowed the SAS to continue its work without modification. When one squadron returned for its second tour of Vietnam in February 1970, VC activity in the province was decreasing, and the squadron faced the frustrating prospect of operations limited to reconnaissance tasks around Nui Dat, with some patrols going months without enemy contact or sightings. That frustration was, in its own paradoxical way, the most complete validation possible of everything the Australian SAS had spent 4 years doing. The enemy had been driven out of the areas the SAS patrolled. The silence on patrol was no longer the silence of careful concealment. It was the silence of a jungle that the enemy had decided was too dangerous to inhabit. The methodology had worked so thoroughly that it had hunted itself out of a job in the province's interior. What remained, in the years after the Australian withdrawal and through the eventual reunification of Vietnam under communist government, was a body of operational knowledge so distinctive that it outlasted the war that produced it. The Australian SAS emerged from Vietnam as arguably the most effective jungle special operations unit that conflict had generated. Not the largest, not the most celebrated in the popular press, the most effective. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment achieved kill ratios exceeding 30-1, operated for weeks without support, and developed a reputation among the Viet Cong Asma Rung, jungle ghosts. They perfected small unit tactics that seemed impossible. 6-man patrols, ambushing company-sized enemy forces, and walking away without casualties. The American general who brought his folder to Nui Date in 1968 was not a stupid man. He was not a cowardly man. He was a product of a military system that had been built to fight a specific kind of war, large-scale, firepower-intensive, metrics-driven. And that system had no category for what he was looking at when he reviewed the Australian SAS patrol reports. His instinct to standardize, to bring outliers into conformity, to apply validated doctrine to methods that appeared irregular, was a rational response within his own framework. He just happened to be presenting that framework to the one unit in the entire Allied order of battle in Vietnam, whose results most conclusively demonstrated its limitations. The Australian squadron commander, who said almost nothing in response, understood all of this. He understood it with the same patience he had spent years cultivating in his soldiers for the jungle. Some things cannot be explained in a briefing room. Some things can only be demonstrated slowly, over months and years, in terrain that doesn't care what the manual says. The Meteo Mountains didn't know about American doctrine. The Viet Cong trail networks didn't conform to any standard. The jungle offered nothing to those who tried to impose their framework on it, and everything to those who were patient enough to learn its own language. The folder stayed on the table. The patrols continued. The Australian military effort in Phu Oc Tue deserves more credit than it has been given or is likely to get. As with limited troops and inadequate support and resources, the Australian task force kept substantial Viet Cong forces off balance, disrupted their supply routes, and occasionally inflicted heavy casualties on them. The SAS was the reason that was true. Not the only reason, but the irreplaceable reason, the one element of the Australian order of battle that could not be replicated by any other unit, and the attempt to standardize them, to bring their tactics into doctrinal conformity, to make their methods legible to a framework that had been built for an entirely different kind of war. That attempt failed, as it deserved to fail, as the results themselves made clear it would fail. 5 men in the darkness of the Mae Tao Mountains, moving at the speed of caution, listening to a jungle that told them everything they needed to know. 1 brief radio transmission per day to a base that was trusting them to be right. And somewhere in the American chain of command, a folder of directives that never got opened, sitting on a table in a briefing room at Nui Dat, collecting the particular dust of a war that the manual couldn't explain. Their tactics were not in the doctrine. That was the whole point. And the silence on the other side of that table was the most eloquent answer the Australian SAS ever gave.